Welcome, Easy Investors, to our Digital for Good webinar with Chris Skinner and Charles Savage. As many of you know, Charles Savage is our CEO, and he's going to be asking Chris, our amazing author, some questions about his book. It's not going to be your usual webinar. They'll be asking each other questions, nice, easy, conversational, and we're going to find out everything we want to know about Chris Skinner's book. Over to you, Charles. Let's get it going.
Thanks, Jess and Chris. Very lucky to meet you finally. We've kind of engaged virtually, so I guess some more virtual engagement. The first question in lineup, I mean, Digital for Good. I love the title and I love the tagline even more. Stand for something or you will fail. How deeply do you believe that, and why do you think it's so important now?
Thanks, Charles, and thanks for having me on the show. These ideas have been bubbling away for quite some time, and specifically towards the end of the last decade, where we were seeing Greta Thunberg and Attenborough and lots of other people saying we are facing a climate emergency. Extinction Rebellion started to become activist protesters against the way in which the system worked. And specifically, I saw a lot of companies emerging that took the idea of technology and finance for creating a new business model that could be purposeful and supportive of a better planet and a better society. A lot of that coming from the Fintech community, but equally from the business community. It wasn't just on left field, it was becoming front and center. And so that's what inspired the book. And then I realized that if I talk about using technology to create a better world, it just sounds like Chris Skinner moaning in the periphery. But if I invited lots of people like yourself to join in, then it becomes a movement, and hopefully that's what it will be.
Cool. And you know, I think where you sort of note that the fintechs were kind of leading the charge here. Do you think that big institutions are paying it lip service, or do you think that there's a meaningful engagement around the topic and they fundamentally believe that they've got to invest heavily in digital that does good?
The whole idea is you can use technology and digitalization to do better things for stakeholders, not just for shareholders. A good example is one of the contributors is Rabobank, which is an agricultural bank active in your part of the world and many other regions, but based in the Netherlands. And they're linking sensors in the fields of farmers to their insurance systems to provide better insurance coverage and services. So some of the banks are making active movements. Others, unfortunately, are just doing what I would call greenwashing. And that's basically saying we're doing ESG, corporate social responsibility, behaving responsibly, we're into the environment. And when you look under the hood, they're actually trashing the world. And a good example, in fact, I just blogged about this, is HSBC, where they're one of the biggest investors in fossil fuel firms and fracking and non-renewable, non-sustainable organizations and companies, and their head of responsible investing was just making a presentation last week and said, as a bank, you know, our average loan is for 6 years. We don't care what happens to the earth in the seventh year. Our focus is just on the next 6 years. So to me, that is irresponsible banking.
Yeah, and you know, I think at the center of your book is kind of this purposeful led organizations. The other side of that coin, though, really is profit. How do the two coexist, and who leads the decision making in an organization? I mean, do you think that organizations have to do things that are purposeful, that can make profit, or do you think profit for purpose? For me, it's a fine balancing act. You know, how do you think the future organization looks at prioritizing the initiatives, and which ones succeed?
It's a balance. I mean, obviously, you need to return a revenue and profit that exceeds costs. Otherwise, you go out of business eventually. Although, having said that, a lot of startups can be unprofitable for years. Again, I was just reading, for example, that JP Morgan Chase believe that their new bank in Britain, which is a digital bank, will be loss-making to the tune of $500 million a year for the next 5 years. So, the startup costs of anything new, whether it be from an existing bank or a new fintech startup, can begin unprofitably, but eventually it has to make profit. Otherwise, it's unsustainable as a business. But you then have to balance making profit with the needs of society, the community, the customer, and the employee, and the stakeholders. And so, if you're purely making profit for shareholder return, then that to me is also unsustainable, and that's part of the focus of the book, to say, you need to make a profit, but with purpose around stakeholders. And that's what the stand for something or you will fall and fail is about, which is saying, what is the reason why you exist? And there's interviews in the book with various companies like Discovery Group, who you all know, around what's their purpose, which is to make health through wealth. And in fact, I know your purpose, Charles, because you shared it with me, is to use your technology and finance experiences along with your failed experiences to make investing easy for everyone. And I was interested that you mentioned failed experiences. What does that mean, and how does that shape your thinking?
Yeah, look, I've been around digital before it was fintech. I mean, I've been building online trading systems and investment platforms since '98, so a long time ago. And in the early stage of trying to do that, I guess the failure was driven by the fact that we didn't recognize the ecosystem wasn't strong enough. So, if you think about back then, and you look like you're a similar age to me, dialing in on 28.8K modem, and there was just, most of the world was unbanked. And so I guess our failure was just that we were naive, and that we fast forward to 2008, where we'd built a really sustainable global business. We had customers in 44 countries all around the world. We've got a kind of Icarus complex about how easy it was to do business globally as a little South African startup. And we've created a derivatives online trading platform with the UK called CFDs. And in 2008, all of our counterparties went under, and all of our customers went under, and so did we, along with it. And all the lessons that I learned about business, I learned in the next 2 to 3 years that followed that radical failure. It was a deep review of what we'd got wrong in building the business, in the recognition that there was nothing sustainable about selling 10-to-1 geared instruments to sophisticated day traders, where 90% of them lost their money and only 10% sort of washed their face, and the top 1% made a bit of money for themselves. And it was kind of introspectively looking at that, I sort of lost interest in the direction that I'd taken from 98 to 2008, and then even all the way into 2012. But the one thing that struck me is that this promise of democratization, of enabling digital financial services for everyone, when I looked at the excuses of 98, they'd gone away. The ecosystem had radically enhanced. Data was now cheap. Smartphones were in the game and getting cheaper all the time. Money, key, I think money is probably the biggest enabler of these businesses, was moving freely through the ecosystem. If you think just 5 years ago, money didn't move so freely. People were still depositing checks and moving it very slowly. So I went back and said, well, if the ecosystem's stronger and we've learned a lot from our failures into 2008, what if we started from ground zero again? And same purpose, democratize access to all things investing, and fundamentally leave a legacy that 100 years from now, somebody turns around and says, well, how did these emerging markets get so wealthy? And someone says, well, EasyEquities were part of that storyline. And it was really just in abandoning all of the failed strategies that we'd applied before, recognizing that the ecosystem was much stronger, leveraging parts of the ecosystem that were really strong, and seeing them as distribution opportunities and channels of partnering our platform into those spaces, and essentially following a simple rule, which was, if it's been done before, don't do it. So don't try and recreate services and put a new skin on them. Radically think about how different they could be. That was the sort of birthplace of EasyEquities 7 years ago. And that's been, I guess, the storyline of a whole lot of fintechs that really took old world business models and looked at a new world ecosystem, and did things differently. But at the center, I think, of our success One is that we had this deeper desire and purpose that wasn't attached to an income statement. I've never built a business in my life where the last thing we did was ask the question, well, how are we going to make money out of this? It was very much driven by what our clients' needs are and what's the right price for those needs. And then the second one is that we focused very heavily, not on the technology stack, and I'm a technologist, having built technology for a long time. It's hard for me to say it. Really, the technology doesn't matter. It's not a lasting differentiator. It's the delivery of that technology, the user interface to your customer. How does that feel and grab, and how does it touch them and inspire them? So it's more of the creative application of technology. And we focused all of our attention on those two things. And in the results, it looks like it was an easy journey. But yeah, we've created some real special outcomes. Something that, to push the question back at you, but is it, capitalism, Wall Street, do they buy into, profit through purpose, or is Wall Street still profit at all costs? And I guess what's the two things that are kind of sitting in the back of my mind. The one is that you can find in the ESG sector that, arms manufacturers are back in favor, and so is coal and dirty fuel, and Tesla's just been kicked out of the top 500, or is Wall Street serious about this?
It's getting there, and it's not something that happens overnight, obviously. But you just mentioned Wall Street and the S&P, for example, Standard & Poor's, and they now have the ESG list, which, as you say, Tesla's dropped out of, much to Elon Musk's annoyance, because Exxon Mobil is in the list. And the reason is that ESG is about environmental, but also social and governance. And Tesla has a lot of issues around internal management and racial discrimination and treatment of their employees, which is why they've dropped off the list. And I would say it's changing slowly. Part of the inspiration for the book was Jamie Dimon, who was leading the Business Roundtable in the USA, delivering a stakeholder capitalism manifesto in October 2019, to which over 180 of the biggest US corporations signed up to. And the idea is it's not just about shareholder. You have to have a stake in community and society, and looking after all of the concerns of community and society, not just profit. How serious that's taken, that's a different question, because a lot of it is talk the talk and not walk the walk. So immediately after the stakeholder manifesto was delivered to the US government, Amazon and Jeff Bezos, who had signed up to this agreement, laid off a load of people with zero notice. And that's not the right way to treat employees. That's not the right way to look after stakeholders. So there's a balance here. And as I say, obviously you have to make a profit to be a sustainable business, one that can have longevity. If you're continually loss-making, you don't exist. Having said that, making a sustainable profit and looking after employees and customers and society and community is equally, obviously, a firm balance. And I think Wall Street is waking up to that big time, as are the investment community. In fact, one of the key things I've noticed is a squeeze from two perspectives. On the one hand, the investment community, the pension fund managers, the asset managers, the people who are the bank's customers, the financial community customers, are starting to say, we're worried. If we don't look after community and the world, then we don't have a future for our children and grandchildren. And so there's activist investment pressure on all institutions. And then on the other hand, there's activist consumer pressure. I mentioned Extinction Rebellion, who contributed to the book. And in fact, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Gail Bradbrook, is a regular guest of mine on my blog. And I'm not endorsing what they do as activist protesters over climate, but I think they need to have a platform and a voice to engage with the financial community and discuss the issues, which is what I'm trying to broker. And that's what the book's about. So bottom line is there's a lot of pressure And the reason the pressure's on the financial firms is that the financial industry funds the fossil fuel firms. And if the financial industry puts pressure on their companies that they're lending to and supporting financially, then they can change their behaviors. So it's a waterfall effect from government through the financial industry, through the fossil fuel corporations and those that are harming the planet. I mean, I know from what you say, Charles, you're engaged quite heavily with democratizing the community for investments. You must be hearing these messages from the people who use EasyEquities.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was going to make. I mean, there's no doubt that the younger our investor base is, and just to put some demographics around it, so our average investor is 31 years old, 42% female, 58% male, and demographically a reflection of the South African fabric, so mostly Black South Africans. And there is absolutely no doubt that in that demographic, there is, for them, it's profit through purpose. It's not profit at all costs. And they're voting, with their capital. Now, institutions are still weighing them out. But what we've seen over the last decade is that the wave of retail capital is starting to influence and shake up Wall Street. We've got lots of cases where they've driven stocks to crazy highs and probably got the wrong headlines. But fundamentally, I think that the shift is towards the decentralization of capital and the retail taking back the reins of where their money goes. And so if you play that out and over 30 years, because as I agree with you, this is not a short-term shift, this is a slow-moving tide. But 30 years from now, I fundamentally believe that the allocators of capital are going to be you and me sitting at home, deciding on which companies we're going to support, and not institutions sitting in boardrooms, which fundamentally their incentive schemes are driven by how much money they can make for you. But there's no purposeful intent in most of those organizations today. So are 60 that they will 80% of the capital flows will be controlled by them directly, and when they do, the institutions that win will look more like Tesla and take Tesla's the stuff that you talked about out. But what I mean by that is that you've got a CEO who is 100% engaged with his community, his investors directly. He's not relying on Wall Street to tell his story. He's telling it for himself. And he's fundamentally invested in changing the world, whether that's the Boring Company or SpaceX or Tesla. And whilst that's not delivering, I guess, across his entire stack of surfaces or platforms, but I think the future is going to look much more like Tesla today than it does look like Exxon, today. So, yeah, there's no doubt for me that these 31-year-olds have put purpose ahead of profit. It's not to say that they invest to make money. Let's be clear, but not money at all costs. And the other thing I think is that is interesting is they want to attach themselves to the brands of his business. They want to be part of the storyline. They want to say, I invested in this and I invested because it made a difference. And because it made a difference, I made a profit. So it is an interesting shift.
So interesting, because I've got a lot of friends in African nations, but particularly in South Africa. There's been a lot of energy issues in your country. And that must change people's perspectives around how they view government and energy and industry. Yeah,
I mean, it's the democratization of power would be nice in South Africa, and it is, the shift is on. I mean, and you can see it again. Like the projects that are getting investment are all green energy projects. No one's investing in starting a coal-fired power producer. But there's no doubt that the topics that are driving the agenda, I guess, in Africa are slightly different. It's more infrastructure driven than it is Tesla. We're not worried about whether we can have battery driven cars. We're worried about whether we can just keep the lights on. And so, slightly different investment cases there in Africa, but for sure, we're seeing that play out. Just a question on the book. What was the most surprising thing that came out of reading your own book? I mean, I know that it was co-authored in the sense that you had lots of contributors, but what was the unexpected finding that came out of the book?
Say it's that so many people who contributed are supporting the reasoning behind the premise that we can use technology and finance for good. Specifically, I think I was surprised to find that people from Extinction Rebellion through to the Bitcoin Foundation, through to Rabobank and venture capitalists were in agreement with the themes, but all had different nuances and angles. So, for you, for example, it's about the democratization of investing. For the Bitcoin Foundation, it's the democratization of finance overall. And then equally, we've got all these different pressures. So people saying, why have you got the Bitcoin Foundation in there when Bitcoin is trashing more energy than most countries to mine the coins? And the answer is a bit of a glib one, to be honest, which is that we will solve those issues because that's what people do. And I'm summarizing in general, but I think overall, what resonated with me, and I reached out to so many people with different perspectives around the world, across Asia, Africa, Europe, America, is that everyone believes the same thing, and that is that we can use technology and finance to change the world to be better. The question is, how soon can we do that? So by way of example, and to your point about the thing we were just discussing in South Africa around energy, is that you cannot switch off the energy production we use today tomorrow. It takes time. I live in Poland because my wife is Polish, because everyone always asks me, why do you live in Poland? But I live in Poland because my wife is Polish, and this country is completely dependent upon coal energy. You cannot switch off coal energy tomorrow because Poland would disappear and implode because it wouldn't be able to sustain business and society. But what you have to do is put in a plan to switch to renewable energy over time, and that's what the financial system can influence and achieve. And the point that Gail makes from Extinction Rebellion is we want banks to stop funding new fossil fuel projects and ventures. And I agree with that. Why should we have new ventures? What we should be doing is saying all existing ventures can be funded and supported, but any new ventures have to be done on a renewable and environmentally sustainable way. And that's where I think we have a problem right now. Going back to what I mentioned about HSBC, the banks are investing, particularly the big banks, and by that I mean the big four American banks, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo fell off the ESG list with S&P, just like Tesla. HSBC, Barclays, they're supporting fracking, they're supporting new unsustainable projects, and that's where we have to change the attitude. And what that comes down to is to your community, that people investing in these organizations can influence how those organizations work. So we can use the likes of the EasyEquities community to change the thinking of the big bank community.
Are the banks, are they the core of of digital? Are they the enemy? Or should we be fine? And I know you've written about this in other books, and you're kind of a thought leader on this as well. But do we need to go around the banks, through them? Do we need to partner them? It kind of sounds like in a lot of instances they're the coal of the energy industry, and maybe we shouldn't be investing any time and effort in moving them forward. Maybe all of our time and effort should be to displace them and replace them with fintechs.
Well, I always come from a banking viewpoint, primarily because that's where I spent most of my life working. But I've never worked for a bank. I've always worked for technology companies, which a lot of people haven't noticed. But what that means is when I look at banks from their perspective outwards, I can see there's a lot of issues they face. They don't understand technology well enough. They're not truly digital. They're not born on the network in the same way as companies like your own. But when I talk to fintech companies, if they talk to me about replacing a bank, then I kind of smile, because I don't believe that's going to happen. What I advise fintech companies to do is solve the things that banks do badly, or create new services that banks don't offer. And that's where I think the wealth will be created for the next generation of the startup community. Companies like yourself, Stripe, Adyen, Klarna, Plaid, there's so many out there I could point to who are generating new ideas using technology and not trying to boil the ocean. They're just trying to do one thing really well that banks do badly, and fix that one thing, and that's how they make money. And then the role of a bank is to look at all these companies, and there's 26,000 startups out there in fintech. It's huge. $210 billion of investment last year from the venture capital, private equity, and financial community. The fact is, why is all that money going out there? Why are there so many companies out there starting up and doing this? Well, the answer is because there's so many things banks do badly. So what banks need to do is say, let's stop trying to do everything ourselves. Let's pick these companies like EasyEquities and bring them into our community and work with them. I mean, I love the fact that in your chapter in the book, you said there's three major things that are changing the investment markets, which is technology making it easy to access, the fact that most of the traditional banks' strengths are actually now their weaknesses, which is that they try and do everything and boil the ocean themselves. They shouldn't do that. And investors' views and investors' motives. So, I mean, you must see traditional financial services, it's got a weak underbelly.
Yeah, it has. I think when I look at, I love what you said about, staying focused in a vertical, and just doing what the banks don't do well in that vertical. And I think the playbook for fintechs, I guess, for the last decade has been that. More recently, you're starting to see some of these scaled fintechs now verticalize, so they're doing more and more. So Square is an example, and many others. And you wonder whether they're starting to behave like banks, and recreating a banking model where they're just a digital reinvention of what a bank is. My personal views is that the next JP Morgan, the next Chase, the next HSBC will not be born out of someone who tries to build those verticals themselves. I think it'll be born out of somebody that creates a brand and a purpose statement that people believe in, and then partners the verticals and brings it into a common operating environment or common interface. And so I think the future of big bank is going to be a collection of best-in-class fintechs that don't have, I guess, the arrogance to think they can do everything themselves, and recognize that their success was built on being very strong in a specific vertical. And so they partner people with the same best-in-class kind of experiences. And I think that's a really exciting prospect, because I think we've got a really strong banking infrastructure. And I laugh at the fact that super apps are, it's a new thing. F&B has been a super app for over a decade. It's just an unbelievable banking experience. You can do anything on it, and it would take another decade before any of the super financial apps catch up. But I do fundamentally believe that the future of banking is going to be a collection of best-in-class partnerships. And I think behind them will be banking rails, traditional banking rails, custody, settlement, cash. But the front end will be owned by fintechs.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite examples of a bank that's actually changing the world is Nubank, that came out of Brazil. And I've just been in Brazil talking at a conference about them and lots of other things. They're now also in Colombia and Argentina, Peru. They're expanding across South America. And they had an IPO at the end of 2021 with a valuation of $50 billion, which is more than most Brazilian banks, 45 million customers. But when you look at how they started, and it was around 2013, 2014, they saw the problem, which is basically the Brazilian banks had a lock hold on the marketplace, and that couldn't be broken because the government wouldn't give a fintech startup a bank license. But a fintech startup could attack credit card fees, and the Brazilian banks actually charged a huge overhead on credit cards, which is how Nubank started. So they were 25% of the cost of cards from traditional banks. They also offered much more financial inclusion. And the way they described it is that if the banks were the Darth Vaders of this world, then cards were the Death Star. And that's what they focused on, the weak underbelly. And then they expanded over time because the government could see that they were doing a good job, they could be trusted, the management team was a good team, and they gave them a banking license. And now they're a fully fledged bank across many South American countries. And as I say, one of the unicorns. And what really gets me, and this statistic blew me away when I saw it, I don't know if you've seen it, but in 2010, the fintech community market cap valuation was 3% of the complete financial market valuations of banks. Today, at the end of 2021, it's 38%. So we can dismiss innovation and invention in finance from the traditional standpoint as being something that's just noise. It's not noise, it's actually fundamentally changed the way in which people think about money. And that's what I like about what you're doing. In fact, I wanted you to comment because, again, in your chapter, you talk about people might invest in Nike or in Apple because of their ethical stance. Do you really believe that is how people think?
Yeah, I 100% think it is. And we've got evidence of it. I mean, in South Africa, if you just weighed up a couple of competitive brands, and the investment case looks quite similar. You know, they've got kind of similar ROIs, but the ones that get the most attention aren't necessarily the ones that are delivering the best profits to their customers and therefore the most share price appreciation. It's the ones that are doing better, much more for the community. You know, it's very much community driven, and is the impact felt where I live. So it's not just about, you know, it can't be intangible. It can't be things that you say. It's got to be things that actually impact them on the ground. So a lot of our retailers do a lot of good. Discovery is a great case study of a purposeful business that's having impact everywhere. And because that impact, you can feel it and touch it, it resonates with those customers, and they want to attach themselves to it. So there's no doubt. And I think Africa, it's a real opportunity for Africans to own this innovation wave. You know, what you just said around Nubank, it was probably owned by the venture capitalists. You know, all of that value appreciation was still sitting with Wall Street. I think because we're kind of a decade later, this innovation is starting to make an impact. You know, success stories like ourselves, and there are probably another 10 or 15 on the continent that have made a significant impact in small places, but it isn't impact that we could measure at 36% of, you know, of financial services in Africa. It's probably less than 10%. But I think the difference is that because we're a little bit later stage, something like EasyEquities can ensure that that value shift is the retail investor benefit. So it's not Wall Street who's sitting there owning the outcomes of this disruption, but rather the retail investors. And two things attract their attention. The one is innovation. They are drawn like moths to a flame, innovation. They love people that are trying to do things differently, and especially where that difference impacts them in their daily lives. And then the second one is that impact, the social impact in their communities, where they see that these things are them uplifting their communities and their friends and family. So, and I think it's an exciting opportunity for Africa. Like Africa has kind of leapfrogged. We've never had to own, you know, telephones, physical infrastructure. Africa's never going to own PCs. I think it's also going to skip Wall Street and venture capital. I think that the retail investor is going to own these opportunities for themselves, and so you're going to see huge wealth creation in the next, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades as this innovation disrupts the African landscape. Last question from me, and if you think about when you wrote this book, capital flows were in abundance. Like, I've never seen money so freely available for good ideas, and purposeful organizations tend to have a lower kind of profit margin because they're not doing it at all, not creating products just for profit. What do you think this recessionary environment? Yeah, I use the word. But what do you think this recessionary environment? What do you think the impact's going to be on this wave of capital, and therefore, which are the organizations that will attract the scarcer capital in the 2-3 years ahead?
It's pretty clear from many research studies that organizations with a clear purpose and a shining light about what they exist for have a longevity that's far greater than those that don't. And there's been many studies I've seen over the years, and I can't name one offhand right now, but you just need to Google it. Companies that have clear values, purpose, and vision have longevity. And I think the issue for a lot of firms right now is, take the example of the 26,000 companies I mentioned who are startups. Did they start up to actually achieve something and have something written on their tombstone that would say these guys did well, or did they start up just to sell out because they felt that they were copying a good idea, or they just wanted to make some money? And the ones that are in the latter category are the ones that are going to really suffer right now. I'm already seeing it in terms of valuations are going down, access to capital is going down. Y Combinator, which is one of the biggest Silicon Valley investment companies, has just said you need a runway. If you don't have a runway, you're going to fail this year or next, because we're entering a recessionary climate. You need to cover costs. The startups, surprisingly, are laying people off. So we are in a tight moment. And bear in mind, exactly as you said, access to capital last decade was really easy. Most of these companies have never been in this situation, and they don't know how to deal with it. And maybe they're running at their normal run rate, but their burn rate is going to burn them out. So my advice right now is batten down the hatches, guys. We're entering a storm. If you haven't got the right ship with the right structure, then you better do something about it right now, and do it yesterday. Don't wait till tomorrow.
Cool. I agree with that completely. I mean, I think for the most part, these startups haven't seen the other side of the cycle, and do they have the resilience and persistency? And the test will be, if they have that purpose, then I believe they will. Then the resilience and persistency will be there because they're doing it for a greater reason than creating value for themselves and shareholders. But I think the tide is, I think you'll find that, I think it was Buffett who said it, that when the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked. And I think we're going to see the tide go out, and I think the top 20% of purposeful organizations will win. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Let me just ask you one last question, Charles. Which is,
do you want to respond? Sorry.
Yeah, one last question for you, which is, I mentioned burn rate, run rate, tombstones, etc. But what do you see as EasyEquities in 2030? I mean, what do you want to achieve?
It's simply that we want people to look back and say, how was this wealth created? Why are South Africans so wealthy in such a short period of time? And we want to be included in the answer. We want someone to say, well, it's because EasyEquities democratized that access, because they educated us. And what we're looking to achieve. And by 2030, hopefully not just South Africa. Hopefully we will be scaled into probably 10 markets by then, or as many as that are needing of our business model. And you talk about runway, the most sophisticated market in the world, which is the US, only 21% of US citizens have direct access to shares. And that's despite the fact that there's been a radical disruption in the last 10 years. So the runway to drive this democratization is massive. The global stage is there. It's a competitive landscape, as you know. And so we've got to pick the places that we think we'll do best in. And for us, we like places where you need mosquito repellent, where our competitors are too scared to go. But that's simply what we're looking to do, is to be part of the storyline as to why and how this wealth was created. Thanks, Chris. Such a good to meet you online. Good luck with your book. We'll certainly promote it to all our easy investors. I think they'll love it. And it'll probably drive them to some smarter investing, some more purposeful investing in the years ahead. And look forward to catching up with you sometime in person. Thanks for joining us.
With you, Charles. Thanks for inviting me.